All right, my name is Alex Ortiz. I'm a reporter with the Herald News in Joliet here for Shaw Media, Illinois, and the Daily Herald. Today we're speaking with Congressman Bill Foster, who represents the 11th Illinois Congressional District. And Congressman Foster, you are running for, what term would this be that you're running for in Congress?
Well, it's a little bit complicated. I represent the old 14th district, the Dennis Hastert seat, which was basically Aurora going out to the Mississippi River. And that started in 2008, and I lost in the Tea Party wave election in 2010, returned to Congress in a very heavily contested campaign against Judy Biggert, who represented much of the area for quite a while. And have returned to the new 11th district, which represents actually the first, second, and third largest cities of Illinois. Sorry, the second, third, and fourth largest cities of Illinois, in the form of Aurora, Joliet, and Naperville.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you, try to cover a lot of topics here, but let's jump right into it. I'm going to start where we started with your opponent, which is this comes in the context we've had probably a week and a half or so of a lot of news coverage about statements that President Trump has made that have very much riled a lot of people regarding fallen soldiers and his knowledge of the coronavirus pandemic. You've spoken out quite a bit about these comments and other actions him and his administration have taken. I was going to ask you this. Do you think the 2020 election is a referendum on the president?
Yes, I think it pretty much has to be, at least in part. One of the major differences in our race is that, my opponent actually in one of the interviews gave President Trump an A+ rating for his coronavirus response. And I don't see how any reasonable person can look at the facts and make that conclusion. After all, we have roughly 4% of the world's population and 20% of the world's cases and deaths. And that doesn't sound like A+ performance to me. And the tragedy is so much of this could have been avoided. If you look at comparably wealthy countries, everything from Germany, New Zealand, South Korea, Australia, even Canada, you see much smaller numbers of deaths per capita than we saw in the United States. And many of these countries were hit earlier and harder than the United States. The difference has to be the leadership. That in the countries where they got a much better result against this tragic pandemic, the difference was that the leaders listened to experts, explained the facts of this disease correctly to the population, and explained why it was necessary, and particularly early in the pandemic, when we didn't have any real medical response available, that the only thing that we had was behavioral control, things like social distancing, wearing masks. Initially, until you got it under control, shutting down large segments of the economy. And this is the strategy that has worked in many advanced countries and failed tragically here because the president simply didn't want to face the reality and preferred, he thought of this generally as as a public relations problem rather than a public health problem. And just to put it in a nutshell, and his interpretation and his explanation to the American public, has resulted in what will probably ultimately be hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths in the United States of America. Current projections are, by sometime around the end of the year, we will be about at the total number of American deaths of World War II. And as I say, this did not have to happen. And the fact that my opponent views this as an A+ performance is something that I think most Americans can't agree with.
Something very much related to this that I'm curious about your analysis of is kind of this apparent decline in trust of our public institutions, especially our scientific expertise. You're a PhD physicist, you have a background in science, you've spoken a lot about this. And it's actually kind of come to a head locally in Will County here recently with some local officials, mostly Republicans, very much questioning data that's coming out of the Illinois Department of Public Health. I don't know if you've seen this, but we're under some extra restrictions for our high positivity rate, and it's very frustrating to a lot of people. But
Yeah, and I think DuPage County is unfortunately right now headed that direction too.
Yes, yes, and others as well. So local people here, obviously, it's frustrating, but it's somehow turned into open questioning, if not sometimes outright dismissal and skepticism of just public health data. Literally, I was listening to a Will County committee meeting today, this past week, where one of the members who's in leadership actually said he just doesn't believe the numbers. He just thinks they're made up, and he just dismisses them out of hand. I imagine this is concerning to you, and I'd like to hear kind of your analysis and how do we fix this problem?
Yeah, well, this is a result of a decades-long, systematic, well-planned attack on the credibility of, official sources of information. That, the first time I encountered this in politics was actually back in the Tea Party wave, where a number of members of Congress and a number of political people all over the country got elected by saying things that they knew were not true. These are things like Obama is from Kenya, or death panels, and there's a long list of these things. And the fact that that a policy of deliberately lying turned into a politically winning strategy has had a very corrosive effect, and Donald Trump is only the end point of that strategy. This is there's been for decades now point of view that everything that government does is wrong, and all politicians are liars, and so on and so forth. And it's very different. I'm a scientist for most of my career. And if you're a scientist and you stand up and say something that you know is not true, it is a career-ending event. And it should be much more like that in politics. And I think there used to be a stronger insistence on telling the truth in politics and by our officials. I personally make a very strong distinction between the career professionals who are doing their job as best they can see, and the level of political oversight and spin mastering that we're seeing, particularly in the Trump administration. I know personally many of the dedicated career professionals in the National Institute of Health, in the Center for Disease Control, and so on. And these are dedicated scientists, and they are trying to, in a very uncertain time, trying to get the facts out to the public as best they can. And there have been reports, there was one just today, of the Center for Disease Control having the numbers reported to them, analyzed and reported by the scientists, and then a Trump political appointee modifying their reports, just saying that this goes against what the president is saying. We are just going to change the answer. And this, like I say, if you try something like that in science, even once, you're just out of the business. Your university will kick you off the faculty. You will never get another peer-reviewed grant in your life. And because whenever you're operating on the edge of uncertainty, as scientists always are, we're always trying to figure out what is true and what's not in a situation where the statistics are small, because you're talking about things not yet discovered. We have understood how dangerous it is to have anyone deliberately lie. And that's the difference. And we are learning in our politics how dangerous it is to allow people to deliberately lie and let those lies go unchallenged. For a long time, people just thought, well, it makes ugly politics, but it's pretty entertaining to see who can make up the most amusing lie about their opponent. But now people are dying because politicians have lied. And that's, I hope, a lesson that our country will learn. And to behave maybe a little more scientifically and a less like this is partly, if you look around Congress, the most common occupation by far are lawyers. And if you're a lawyer arguing a case, it's a very different thing. It's not what is true, but it's what I can convince a jury is true. And that's a very different calculation. Something that sounds good, particularly to someone that doesn't have a long time to think about the problem and sort through all of the complicated facts, may often be, persuaded about a quick and good sounding argument that actually doesn't hold up under detailed examination. And so that's one of the problems with politics is, I have to be careful because my father was a lawyer. Dad was actually, and my son is a lawyer. And my son is a patent lawyer at a big law firm downtown. And my father was a civil rights lawyer who wrote much of the enforcement language behind the Civil Rights Act of '64. So law can do wonderful things for society. When you look over, above the court and see equal justice under law as the goal of our system, there's a lot of good that's done when people really believe that is the goal. And you can't have equal justice under law if you don't respect facts. That, as much as anything, I think that is what is at stake in this election.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about the Democratic Party for a second, because go back a little bit in time. You obviously drew a primary back in March, and much before the pandemic hit, much was made about kind of these divisions within the Democratic Party, the left versus the moderate side. And I'm just kind of curious because, watching the Democratic convention, which I'm sure you saw at least parts of, it was very interesting to me to see kind of the wide swath of people who were vouching for the nominee, Joe Biden. Just kind of curious with your recent experience with the primary and just seeing what's going on nationwide. Do you think the Democratic Party has done enough to reach out to a broad swath of voters to work towards the goal, ultimately, obviously, of recapturing the White House?
Yeah, I think it's well positioned. I'm very proud when I sit in the Democratic caucus in the U.S. Congress, and you look around and it looks like America. It's not that way if you just look at during the State of the Union or other speeches where you see Congress sitting. Democrats generally sit on one side of the aisle, and there are women, there are people of color. It looks like America. That's not the case on the other side of the aisle, where I think that essentially 100% of, or more than 90% of all Republican members of Congress are white Christian males. And that's simply not what America is. It's not what America ever was, actually, but it's certainly not what America is today. And so I think we've done a good job. I'm personal friends with AOC. She, she and I, she sits down. Well, I'm one row above her at financial services, so but you can still talk. And when we're sitting in committee hearings, and it's the divisions in the Democratic Party are nothing compared to the divisions between the Democratic Party and President Trump. And so that's why you've seen such great unity coming in, since the decision was made that President Biden will be our candidate.
And I think probably one of the other striking things about the party is just how, I guess, I think it's fair to say it's moved slightly more to the left in the last 10 years or so, but probably over your career. You guys have passed a lot of legislation in the House during this term, a lot of very progressive pieces of legislation. And of course, Joe Biden has a very ambitious agenda for when he becomes president. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's safe to say that even if Democrats come in 2021 with a unified government, captured the Senate, kept the House, Joe Biden's president, there is only so much you guys can do just because of the realities of politics these days. I think we've seen that in the last two administrations that came in with unified government. So I'm curious what you would think. What are probably the 2 or 3 biggest policy things that you think the Democrats should focus on, again, if they had unified government in 2021?
Well, I think we have to repeal the Republican tax cuts and more. You know, this put the long-term fiscal health of our country in danger. You know, just uh, the long-term imbalance of wealth in this country is, you know, you can see that sort of in the stock market and the disconnect between the ordinary economy that people feel and the behavior of the stock market, which is, you know, largely held by the top few percent in the United States. And so, yeah, the stock market's back where it was. That's not a big factor in the economic health of ordinary people, at least the ones I talk to. I think there was a recent report, a survey, that half of all American families anticipate real economic trouble in the coming months. And the fact that, oh, don't worry, the stock market is recovered is not relevant to the struggles that they face. And so that's part of it. So in terms of the priorities for the Biden administration, I think we have to continue the progress that was made with Obamacare towards getting universal health care. I think that, you know, I think the difference among Democrats is not so much, you know, it's more a matter of how you get there rather than, you know, and then there's a discussion that will be with us always, which is, you know, what are the limits to the health care that's provided? If you present yourself to our medical system with no money and no insurance, you know, you're not going to get a private room in the Mayo Clinic. You're not going to be able to see every specialist you want. All right, there have to be limits, and that's a very tough discussion. You know, it got weaponized 10 years ago by the Republicans with death panels, where any honest discussion of this, you know, you got accused of, you know, killing grandma. And so this can't be the way the discussion proceeds. And I think that that simple, easy to understand things like lowering the age of eligibility of Medicare, Medicare, raising the benefits of Medicaid for those who are really depending, that is the safety net in our country, and make it universally available and a much higher quality product that covers much more, I think will be a big step forward. And so, you know, that's providing a public option for insurance so that you have a competitive marketplace, which will likely result in lower prices and better insurance benefits for consumers. These are the sort of incremental steps that I think we can realistically accomplish and have them stick. The last time the Democrats had control over everything, I think we made big mistakes in passing in the House bills that, you know, were not supported by the majority of Americans, and never had a chance of making it through the Senate. I think, and we were, you know, taught a brutal lesson for that behavior in 2010. And so I hope that we have learned our lesson. I believe Speaker Pelosi has learned that lesson. And so that I think what we're going to see is, let's get everything done that's supported by the vast majority of Americans. Get those done first. And we'll get credit for that. You know, things like the DREAM Act, which is supported by 90% of Americans. And in fact, resurrecting comprehensive immigration reform. This is the bill that passed the Senate in 2013. I view one of the tragedies of history is that after the bill, the comprehensive immigration reform bill that passed the Senate in 2013 passed, there was a year and a half when the US House could have voted for it, and we were not permitted to vote on it because of, you know, the decision by one person, John Boehner, because his speakership was being held hostage by the Tea Party people who'd been elected. And so, you know, had that happened, we would live in a different world. If we had passed comprehensive immigration reform, then the American public would see how good immigrants are for our system, how good for our economy. And frankly, you know, Donald Trump and much of what he represents would not have existed. And so, so one of our duties is to do is to start and continue with things that the American public um, support, and not just purely Democratic priorities.
Gotcha. Okay, so just to recap there, you said repeal the Republican tax cut bill in 2017, improve upon the ACA, and immigration reform.
Yep, if we got those done, that would be a pretty good session of Congress.
Yeah, I think that would be, by any standard, pretty successful.
Yeah. And then there are incremental things. For example, one of the things that I've been working with on a very bipartisan basis, like my Republican partner is Mike Kelly of Pennsylvania, and is to repeal the ban on having a unique patient identifier, which sounds, what the heck is this? It's some detail of the healthcare policy. But in fact, it is killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. This is, for the last 25 years, it has been illegal to have all of the electronic health record system providers just get together to find a way that you can identify which people have which healthcare records. So that, everyone has gone into a clinic or a hospital, and then they say, oh, can you please fill out these forms? And then you fill out these forms that have, when did you get this vaccination and what surgeries have you had, and all these things you don't remember. When you know good and well that information is sitting on many other computers already, because you fill out very similar forms before. And that doesn't happen in other countries. And the reason it doesn't happen is they have a unique patient identifier. You go in, you say, here is my patient ID number. Here, and you sign a form that says, please collect all of the information associated with that patient ID number, and then poof, all of the health records are brought in from everywhere. And then you don't have a situation where a doctor is working on a patient where they don't actually have a complete list of drugs that they're taking. And because of this, you get drug interaction problems and other tragedies. Anyway, so I've been worried about this for a long time. I talked to the experts and they said it's a huge problem. We've been suffering for this for 25 years. And so my Republican partner encountered this when he was in an emergency room with someone that he knew well. And the doctor was about to do surgery on him and put him under anesthesia. And he said, just a minute, you know that this person is a opioid addict? And the doctor said, oh my God, I had no idea. I was about to give him an opioid, which of course would have triggered a relapse. And this was one of many examples of people who suffered because we don't have a unified healthcare record system and a unique patient identifier. If this had been in place, that actually would have prevented doctor shopping for opioids. One of the big issues that I work on, I've been, all the time I was in Congress, is this growing opioid epidemic. And a big factor in that taking place is what's called doctor shopping for opioids. Someone who gets a legitimate medical prescription starts to get addicted and then goes to different doctors to get additional opioid prescriptions and ends up very badly hooked. There are estimates that roughly half of the people who get addicted come in through that route. And so that would not have happened with the unique identifier. The minute they would have gone to the second doctor and say, okay, let's look at your records. Oh, it says here you're already getting an opioid prescription. Let's sit down and talk about why you think you need 2 opioid prescriptions. So if this ban had not been in place, it would have stopped a big part of the opioid crisis in its tracks. So I'm very proud that last summer with my Republican partner, we got that ban repealed in the House. And then of course the Senate did nothing because the Senate does nothing. But then this time, just about a month ago, it came up a second time and it went through unanimously in the House. Democrats and Republicans, 100% of them in the House. And I think it has a very good chance. And this is going to avoid tens of thousands of American deaths and billions of dollars in unnecessary healthcare costs. All the medical providers hate this because they have to deal with the healthcare records from 5 different sources. They know they don't have the complete version. And even just figuring out if I'm the correct Bill Foster or I'm the Bill Foster that's actually my son who lives in downtown Chicago, are we the same person or not? And trying to sort all that out they waste billions of dollars. So, but that's an example of something that I feel really good about working on in Congress. It's something that sounds small, it's bipartisan, it doesn't, there's not a big fight associated with it, but it's going to save billions of dollars of people's healthcare costs and tens of thousands of lives. And
Yeah.
so that's the sort of good work that Congress has to continue doing. And it's a sort of good work that Vice President Biden did all the time he was in the Senate. He was very well known for being that. That's why I'm optimistic that we could have a really good session of Congress.
Interesting. Yeah, that patient identifier issue, I really had never heard of it because healthcare policy is crazy.
Yeah, but I'm sure you've gone into a clinic and had to fill out those forms
Oh, yeah.
and said, why am I answering these same questions again and again?
Yeah.
You know, even a simple thing like going into a vaccine, get a vaccine. You know, to get vaccinated for flu, they ask you a bunch of questions that you know you've answered many times. If you simply said, here's my patient identifier, here's my, sign off on prescription, and on the permission to have them pull that in, they would get your complete vaccination records, which would make everything cheaper, simpler, and more reliable.
Okay. Switch gears. Let's switch gears here for a second. This is a question I asked your opponent, so I want to give you an opportunity to answer this. Do you think that there is systemic racism in the U.S. criminal justice system?
Unfortunately, yes. This is not, I remember as a child watching, I had a very strange feeling during when SpaceX launched its space capsule, which was during all of the riots here. I had a flashback to my childhood. What SpaceX did essentially reproduced what was called the Gemini Titan program, where you had two astronauts going up, and those flew the year of the riots in Watts. The riots in Watts were triggered by a car stop of, I believe, a pregnant African-American woman that wasn't handled properly, to put it nicely, and that triggered riots. And so this is not a new problem. And the frustrating thing is that a huge majority of police are in their job for the right reasons and are wonderfully behaved and really care about people, and they're put in a tremendously tough situation. I can't imagine how scary it must be to do an automobile stop. You get a hit, assuming it's a legitimate stop, and you say, okay, here's a license plate of someone who's got serious reasons for them to be stopped, and then you have to go and walk up to them when you know that they have violent felonies, often including firearms. And it is your job to go up and tell them that hey, can you come and get out of the car, and I want to talk to you. And that is one of the most dangerous points that a policeman faces. And when every year, dozens, hundreds of policemen lose their lives or are badly injured because of that. And my heart goes out to their families, and I understand why it's easy to get tougher skin than you'd want. On the other hand, I was the days of the where there was trouble in downtown Aurora. I actually was on a Zoom event with many of the African American leaders in Aurora. And on that very night, they were not out there. Interesting. These were kids, many of them that had been involved in gangs when they were younger and are now taking over as the next generation of leaders in Aurora. Some of them very, very impressive kids. Some of them actually, one of them was the son of a policeman. But they also described that, well, actually the Aurora police aren't so bad these days, but when I go into this town or that town, which I won't name, boy, it's bad. The moment you are there, boom, you get stopped for very little reason, and except they believe, and I think that there may be some truth to it. That so that was a very long yes. It is not universal. It doesn't mean that probably there is no large police force that doesn't have one or more bad apples on it, but the vast majority of all policemen are there for the right reason. We just have to get better at sorting it out. The other thing that we should do that has a lot of support on both sides of the aisle is make body cams just universal. There should be a guarantee across the country that if you're involved being stopped by a policeman or involved in interactions with a policeman, that interaction is captured on video. Because I think there's a lot of reason to believe that people behave better if they know that they're on camera. And that's true of both the citizen and the policeman in an interaction. The police originally were very strongly against things like dashboard cams and body cams, but very often they end up strongly in support of it because they get falsely accused of things all the time. They have to go and grab someone who's drunk and isn't going to remember what was actually done, and they make a false accusation. And then when you actually see the video footage, they say, "Oh, I really was that drunk and misbehaved. I think I'm not going to sue the police force over this." So that very often, that can avoid a sort of, well, he said this and he said that type situation where it makes both sides angry. And so I think that is something where the federal government has a real role to subsidize video cameras and video archive storage. And also, there's a big part of the cost of these systems are dealing with freedom of information requests, because it's a very big burden on police force when someone requests the video footage. They have to make sure if there's a police interaction in a crowd that everyone else in the crowd's faces are blurred out, except for those in question. That's not a cheap or easy thing to do, or quick often. It costs them a lot of money to collect all of the information from surveillance video cameras that are all around, that often provide the best evidence of what really happened. And so the federal government providing and subsidizing that technology to lower the burden on local police forces to get really high quality video for a reasonable cost, I think could go a long ways toward just making this a fact-based debate, which would help. I think, the only reason, I represent Sandra Bland, if you remember that situation, or she, who was in my district and then was involved in a pretty bogus traffic stop down in Texas that ultimately resulted in her demise. And that didn't have to happen and shouldn't have happened. And the only reason we know much of anything about the facts of that case are that there were cameras on some of it. So.
Okay, and so obviously, whether it's matters of criminal justice or race or guns or name any issue these days, obviously it becomes a very polarizing thing. I think I remember you hosted a forum on gun violence not too long ago in Joliet, and there at times it got heated because people have different opinions. And I'd imagine, I would say probably regardless of who's in the White House, I'm curious as to what your theory of the case is in terms of how maybe we get back to a country where we can solve those big issues without such divisiveness. I know I've just been through a huge problem here, but I'm kind of curious what your analysis of how we get past that.
Well, I think if I could have one fix in politics today, it would be to get rid of separate Republican Democratic primaries, to just have unified primaries. This is the way they handle it in many states, the states on the West Coast, Maine.
I think they call this like a jungle primary.
Sometimes it's called a jungle. Well, the politicians hate it, right? They just really love these safe seats that get gerrymandered, and then they have a very lightly attended primary election. And so it's, this is what gives the political machines, including in Illinois, their power. That everyone knows if they cross Speaker Madigan, they're not going to have a very nice congressional district drawn for them next time around. And that's sick. And it's not the way politics should work. But if you adopt these systems, where, for example, in California, the top two candidates advance no matter what party they are. Or in Maine, people simply make a list of who their favorite candidates are, and then they take the top candidate. Well, they eliminate the least popular ones one by one, and if your candidate gets eliminated, then you go to your second choice or your third choice. And so it's sometimes called an instant runoff system. But those systems provide a mechanism for a politician to get their 51% out of the middle. Our system is currently designed to pretty much destroy any politician who wants to be in the middle, because such a politician cannot survive a Democratic primary or a Republican primary. And partly because in primaries, it is the more extreme people that turn out. So that even a politician that might have support of 60% of all Democrats will not have the support of 60% of all Democrats in a primary election where only the extremes turn out, and the same thing on the Republican side. And so that our system amplifies partisanship. And you see that difference. And if you look at the local elections, which are generally nonpartisan, city council, mayors, usually people know who's the Democrat and who's the Republican, but it's not such a black and white issue. And there are people who are straight down the middle who regularly get elected to city councils and mayorships. And I think the local politics, it's not perfect, but I think works better than the politics in Washington right now.
Interesting. And so do you think maybe, you mentioned the drawing of legislative districts and gerrymandering. Do you think something should be done about that?
Oh yeah, look, I've signed on to every petition ever since I started in this business 10 years ago. These Change Illinois and other groups like that, trying to eliminate gerrymandering. One of the worst things about it is that when citizens look at those maps, they don't know the details, but they sort of know they're being rooked. And that's very corrosive to people's trust in politics. And one of the encouraging things, the states that have adopted nonpartisan redistricting commissions, usually on those commissions, everyone knows who's the Democrat and who's the Republican. But what happens is you have a very complicated method for getting a 20-person commission to draw the boundaries. Well, I'm asking to return to Congress to represent the people of the 11th District because we have so much work to do, in large part to undo the damage done by the Trump administration to our economy, to our health, to our democracy, and to the rule of law over the last 3.5 years. As a member of Congress, I serve on the House Select Committee on the coronavirus response. As we respond to this devastating pandemic, I'm working to ensure that the voice of science and reason is being heard in our response to COVID, and that the trillions of dollars that Congress has allocated to help protect American workers, their families, their small businesses during this pandemic are actually going where they were intended. I'm also working to make sure that future progress on vaccines and therapeutics for COVID is based on science and facts and not on wishful thinking or on political interference. As a businessman, I understand what will be required to undo the economic damage, the damage to businesses large and small that was done by this pandemic. When I was 19, my brother and I started a company in our basement with $500 from our parents. And that company now manufactures over half of the theater lighting equipment in the United States. It provides more than 1,000 jobs, good manufacturing jobs with good pay and good benefits. And we've kept all those good manufacturing jobs in the Midwest, which is something I'm very proud of because I understand the importance of providing good paying jobs for the middle class. And I look forward to working with President Biden as he puts forward realistic plans for an economic recovery that provides good jobs to all hardworking Americans. This pandemic has laid bare the inadequacy of healthcare in the United States, and I will work with President Biden as he continues to strengthen and expand the Affordable Care Act as we all work towards the goal of universal and affordable medical coverage. And as the only PhD scientist in Congress, I serve on the Science Committee, grappling with scientific and technological issues such as climate change and cybersecurity, in an increasingly partisan atmosphere where, unfortunately, scientific facts and logic are often ignored. As a member of the Financial Services Committee, I was deeply involved in both the emergency intervention to rescue our economy, to rescue the automobile industry, the housing industry, and to stabilize our financial system. And I'm proud that because of that work 10 years ago now, our financial system has not collapsed during the COVID crisis. It did not have to happen that way. Finally, my family's background serves as my guidepost on the important social issues of today. My father was a civil rights lawyer who wrote much of the enforcement language behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that's why I have been such a strong advocate for criminal justice reform, for marriage equality, equal pay for equal work, and a woman's right to choose, and even a woman's access to birth control, all of which are at issue in this election. So I'm asking your vote to return to Congress, to protect and extend our economic recovery, and to make an economy that works for all Americans. Thank you.